Well, nope. Not that idea. What do you mean? Someone smarter and more talented than me has already done a video on the same topic. I guess that's a good point. I have no idea. I'm totally lost here. Hey, honey, what's the date?
It's October 1st.
Scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight.
Scary stories have been with us forever. But some seem to go beyond just a spooky story told around a campfire. Some probe into darker facets of the human experience. These stories dare to ask the question, what is the value in exploring negative human emotion? And as far as explicitly negative movies go, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better example than Tobe Hooper's 1974 classic, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out in 1974, which at this point was almost 50 years ago. While not the original slasher film, that honor probably goes to Psycho, it certainly gave a blueprint for the murdering teenager genre in Hollywood. The gist of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is simple. A group of teenagers travel across the country to find themselves, and instead fall into a nightmare in backwater Texas. Beginning with picking up a disturbed hitchhiker who attacks members of the group, and ending with most of the teens as wall decorations of a particularly homey Texas Airbnb, the movie has captured the imagination of millions across the world, inspiring multiple, always awful sequels. While the most famous ghoul from the movie is Leatherface, an imposing boogeyman who has a particular fondness for power tools, there's a whole family of backwater folks who try to show the city people a good time. From the obviously dead grandpa to the affable face of the family at the local gas station, the villains of Texas Chainsaw Massacre are not complex. They are a hurricane, a nightmare that descends on the unsuspecting children of the 60s enjoying a scenic drive. What is interesting about the movie is how remarkably bloodless it is until the final sequences. While often considered one of the goriest movies of all time, so much of the violence happens off-screen, or is just implied. There are horrifying acts depicted, from the meat hook scene to the original introduction of Leatherface, but in comparison to other gore fests like Saw, Hostel, or hell, even Midsommar, the gore is low-key. But something Tobe Hooper understands is the difference between gore and violence, and even without spattering the screen full of red or depicting organs out of their proper place, the actions in Texas Chainsaw Massacre are some of the most incredibly violent put to film. The movie is short, which is good, because it allows Hooper to keep the intensity cranked up to 11 for a longer percentage of the runtime. If Texas Chainsaw Massacre was too long, it will lose some of its visceral power. If the human brain is kept too long in a state of panic or bewilderment, eventually it loses some of the effect as we either get numb or we start to find the ridiculous exploits of Leatherface funny. But the tightness of the film allows it to throw us into the hellish experience for 80 minutes and leave us speechless for a few minutes after the final credits roll. Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame had a very interesting reaction to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He said in an interview for Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments that at the end, he rewound the tape and watched the whole thing again, which begs a fairly simple question. Why? No, seriously. Why does this movie, chock full of some of the most stomach-churning violence imaginable, captivate the minds of so many? The shooting of this movie was a hellish experience in the Texas summer, some shoots lasting days, to the point that the meat set out in the morning had spoiled by evening. A shoot that captured Gunnar Hansen as Leatherface at the end of the movie, swinging his chainsaw in right arcs that might have been more in character than he was comfortable with. Which begs the question, what's the point? What's the point of experiencing these extreme negative emotions? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre captivated the minds of so many, and continues to endure to this day for many reasons, but probably its best is the ability to harness and express extreme negative emotions, and they aren't the only ones who have succeeded at this task. One look at the band Slipknot tells you why they are connected to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Their masks draw inspiration from many horror movies, but looking at especially the lead singer Corey Taylor, you can draw a fairly clear connection between him and Leatherface. Slipknot's aesthetics draw a lot more from, for lack of a better word, more gnarly horror movies of the 70s than the more polished 80s slasher. They are there to look scary, and while some might see the masks as nothing but a silly gimmick, I always thought they worked. The biggest reason why is, of course, that Slipknot does not just rely on the masks, but instead have been putting out quality work since the late 90s. Now, heavy metal is not everyone's thing, especially not some of the musical places Slipknot goes, but the question for them is very similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Why do people like this? Why do I like this? What does Slipknot's complete embrace of negative emotions have for some people that makes them the most popular metal band on the planet? To find the answer, we have to look at Slipknot's best and most disturbing record, Iowa. So to totally understand what was going on in this record, we have to understand where the band was at personally. Slipknot had risen quickly to worldwide fame based on their self-titled record and incredibly intense live shows. They were having problems touring because no band wanted to bring Slipknot as an opener. Literally half the crowd would leave after the guys played. So they were successful, beyond their imagining, and had a hard time dealing with it. They were unsure if they had careers, and a mix of intense substance abuse as well as bad business decisions meant that they did not see nearly enough of the money their success should have provided. Coming into their second record, they were fairly desperate, and most of the band acknowledges they weren't in a good place. The founder of Slipknot, Clown, has been on record saying, "Everyone says make another album like Iowa." I'm like, fuck you, that album almost killed us. He wasn't totally wrong. The guy who produced the record did it from a wheelchair, and there's a fairly big paper trail of Corey Taylor having some sort of meltdown when recording the title track. I say all this to just point out, a lot of the negativity that comes out in the record is genuine, and it could have been just a total mess of disjointed rage. But it didn't turn out like that. Instead, Iowa blew the doors off and made Slipknot a household name. Now, I want to be clear here. I do not think that pain creates good art. I don't think pain is required, and think the trope of the tortured artist is wrong. I think even if Slipknot wasn't feeling as thoroughly negative when they created Iowa, they would have made something of equal quality because they're talented dudes. But their context affects the album, and their feelings affects what it turned out to be. And what they were able to do was transfer their personal feelings and their context to a really good record. Iowa is divided neatly into two halves. The first part is all about loud, angry, misanthropic music that is supposed to let folks blow off some steam. I don't think anyone's ever written a better people suck song than people equal shit. Yeah, the theme of this is pretty much summed up in the first lines of the second song, Disaster Piece. Yeah, that's the theme. Towards the middle of the album, the anger changes direction, from being good angry music about the world around you, to something, well, different. Something more disturbing. Descending into a nightmare that finishes with the title track dealing with some dark, I guess is the word, themes. And I think it's giving the catharsis that makes it so good. Bad things happen in life, and Slipknot can be a way to understand them, or release pent-up anger, aggression, or other negative emotions. The first part of the album is great about this. But the second part of the album, tracks like Skin Ticket, those are doing something different. Something more like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Creating a feeling that when you make it through the whole song, you feel like you just survived something. It's here that I have to point out another thing I really like about Iowa, the album, specifically about the lyrics. For the most part, Taylor manages to channel his rage in a way that's not just blatantly misogynistic. Remember that I said if Slipknot wasn't careful, their music could turn into just an incoherent rage fest? Yeah, most heavy bands fall into this, and just decide to pick the same thing men have been screaming about for thousands of years: women who won't have sex with them. For a good example of this, let's look at the folks in Chelsea Grin, Chelsea Grin, in one of their most famous songs, the aptly named Banger. Nope, wait. It gets better. Oh, not yet. Not yet. A little bit longer. Okay, so you've got this artwork, this intense vibe of being from hell, and are screaming about a woman you don't like. This is doubly, ironic, given the guys who really like this music often will talk about how rap or pop music is just soulless and about money and, their words, hoes. And this is just the same thing. Just now it's gross because it's got more misogyny on top of it and a weird, anger vibe. But sure, whatever. This can seem kind of harmless, but it's indicative of a lot of the more extreme metal that really just boils down to a bunch of repressed sexual rage that, when presented in the way Chelsea Grin presents it, really should only elicit some giggles instead of a feeling of catharsis or cleansing. The issue is that Chelsea Grin is not the only big extreme metal outfit writing, and while their songwriting can be written off as just kind of stupid, other bands have taken the same template and simply expanded the fantasy to the point where I'm not going to repeat the lyrics here. There's a major escalation in the Whitechapel song Prostatic Fluid Asphyxiation, which simply describes intense sexual violence, while throwing in such gems as "You Deserve It" with the bleh. And what's really damning to Whitechapel is I checked how often they play this song. They played it over 200 times to, I assume, screaming fans who know the lyrics as they are all engaging in this particular fantasy together. At that point, it's not just experiencing negative emotions, it's a power fantasy that doesn't have a place in the most depraved incel forums. Slipknot's second half of Iowa manages to mostly avoid these pitfalls. The title track is the closest they come to indulging in the same kind of feelings that Whitechapel and Chelsea Grin are wallowing within. An important point of difference, however, is that Taylor doesn't often perform the song Iowa. He's only done it a few times in the band's history. Instead of a fantasy he indulges in, the song swirling in manic soundscape is meant to be disturbing, and in the only footage I can find of him performing Iowa, the crowd is completely silent watching him go through it. It's an ordeal, not a fantasy. Instead of a channel for rage, the second half of Iowa album is about going to a dark place, either within yourself or somewhere else, and surviving. The most important part of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the ending. While yes, the main character goes through a horrifying nightmare, the ending does not go for bleak, like for example The Mist or Hereditary. Instead, the main character gets away, leaving Leatherface behind as hopefully just a horrifying memory. But the focus of the camera is on the final girl and her reaction, not just of the terror as Leatherface grows closer, but also what she does, how she realizes she's gonna get away. And that is why Texas Chainsaw Massacre has such staying power. Because the whole point of all the violence, all the pain, all the hatred, and the terror is that you can survive it. Slipknot's second half of Iowa is the same way, especially a song like Skin Ticket, with songs aggressively negative. The point is that when you get to the end, you survived. I wondered why this time of year is usually when I get back into Slipknot, and last year was especially bad. And for a while, I wondered why that might be until I started teaching again this year. And like clockwork, the first thing I wanted to listen to on Spotify was Iowa. You see, negative and difficult stuff happens to us as people all the time. We can be overstressed, overworked, and just burnt out. And while the first year of teaching was not quite as rigorous as escaping a tribe of Texas maniacs, there were still some moments that can feel like... There is a value in being negative when creating art, film, or music. Channeling extreme negative emotions can be more than just an example of lancing the boil of pain or anger, but more so, and remind ourselves that whatever is killing us at that particular moment, we can survive.